This is a presentation from Winchester Academy.
Academy. My name is Ann Berger Linden, and I'm very pleased to say that I'm the Executive Director of Winchester Academy. It's a great organization. I want to thank the City of Waupaca and especially Josh Werner for making this space and all of the technology available so that we can bring you tonight's program. This is the last program of our inaugural virtual series. We will start up again in February when Bryant Esch joins us to discuss sustainability and environmental impacts from the Waupaca Foundry. Tonight's program is sponsored by Helen Robinson. Thank you, Helen. We will have a Q&A session following the program. You may submit your questions via the Facebook comment section or telephone in to 715-942-9917. Again, 715-942-9917. And please hold your questions until the end of the program. Tonight's speaker is Bill Berry. He's a journalist and an author. His 2014 book, Banning DDT, How Citizen Activists in Wisconsin Led the Way, won the 2014 Top Nature Book Award from the Midwest Independent Publishers Association. In 2015, Bill came to Waupaca and spoke at the Waupaca Book Fest. He's a regular columnist for the Capital Times of Madison. Please welcome Bill Berry.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you to the Winchester Academy. 47 years of adult education in the Scandinavian folk tradition. What a great accomplishment. And the list of past speakers that I reviewed on the website is really impressive and also very humbling. Most recently, I think one of your most recent speakers was a good friend of mine, George Kraft, a hydrologist at UW-Stevens Point. I saw a while back you had R.D. Stevenson, the physics of musical instruments, a great friend of mine and a great conservationist in Wisconsin. And also I see Stan Temple was one of the previous speakers. Stan is a researcher, teacher, scientist from UW-Madison, often credited with bringing back sandhill cranes to Wisconsin, and he's going to be inducted into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame next spring. So that's a pretty impressive list. I would make one suggestion that given the pandemic that we in the Scandinavian tradition explore the concept of what is a hygge, that is making comfort in winter in cold climates, and I'm planning to practice that a lot this winter. And speaking of the pandemic, I understand that you usually have a robust crowds of 80 people or so here for your presentation. I'm happy that some of the board members are here to be able to make me not feel alone, and thank you for that. And of course, it's been on our minds for a long time, and this has been one heck of a year. I was just reading a column by a woman named Margaret Renkel today, and reminded me that we need to be careful not to forget that this pandemic is really about the natural world. And I'll just quote her very briefly. One of her paragraphs was, "Our mistake was only partly in believing that the natural world was ours for the taking. Our mistake was also in failing to understand that we ourselves are a part of the natural world. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we can't escape the world we have shaped. We must begin right now to make preserving biodiversity a priority, to make protecting wildlife habitats a priority, to make living in closer harmony with our wild neighbors a priority, And keeping ourselves safe for a future of ever-renewing pandemics will mean completely reframing the way we think about the natural world. It's a tough message, but it's an important one. So again, I'm happy to be here. As the slide says, we're going to talk a little about 50 years after Earth Day. My presentation was slated for last April, I believe, Ann, right about the time of Earth Day celebrations that were supposed to be occurring all across the country and the world on the 50th anniversary. I had several of my own canceled, and others who are much more prominent speakers than me had dozens. So it's a good chance to catch up here a little bit. And what I'm going to try to do is really condense 50 years of conservation and environmental history into an hour presentation. So I apologize for once being too brief in some areas and maybe too wordy in others, but we're going to give it a shot. So part of my presentation will be kind of personal, how I got here, and that will sort of riff off some of the things that were going on around us. So if I can get this baby to fire up. Yeah, briefly, first of all, we're going to have a little fun and talk a little bit about how I got here as a journalist and an author. Also tell some stories about people, some of them who you know, some who you may not know. How did we get to Earth Day 1970? Wisconsin and central Wisconsin had many contributions as Gaylord Nelson, the father of Earth Day, worked us toward Earth Day. We'll talk about some accomplishments since then and some failures in our dealing with our environment. And also maybe a little bit about where we're going here on climate and water in particular, and just overall resilience. So that's just a brief outline of what we'll be doing here. And by golly, look at that. That's the Joannes Park Swimming Pool in Green Bay, Wisconsin, 1964. I lived 3 blocks from the pool. And it was a hot day in July. And if you see those 2 guys right in front and center there with towels on their shoulders, that's my best childhood friend, Nicky Koberger. And the guy with the big ears there and the towel wrapped around him is me. And so I remember as though it was yesterday watching a photographer from the Green Bay Press-Gazette clamber to the top of the pool house and take that photo. And obviously he got us in that photo. And it's run several times in the Green Bay Press-Gazette since then on hot days or cold days when they say, here's how it was in 1964. But I will have you know that Nicky and I were pool veterans. We were on swim team in the morning. We went to afternoon sessions and evening sessions. And with the pool that crowded and with a number of young kids in there was no way we were going in that water. It was turning yellow before our eyes. So that's the swimming pool that I grew up so near, and I didn't really think much about it, but one of the reasons that we were at the pool and not at other swimming areas was most of the other bodies of water in Green Bay where we grew up were not swimmable. Not fishable, not swimmable, and you could hardly stand the smell for much of the summertime. The Fox River was one of the most polluted rivers in America, one of the largest Superfund sites in history. I was 8 blocks downwind from that, our family home on Mason Street, working class neighborhood. 3 blocks the other way was the East River, where you're likely to see tires and anything else floating down the river on this way to the Fox. So we didn't even know there was such a thing as clean rivers. You had to go 20-some miles up on the Green Bay to find water that was swimmable. The famous Bay Beach swimming area in Green Bay had been closed for many years. And so it was a time that we had a great childhood. We had a swimming pool 3 blocks away, but we never swam in a natural body of water, and or very seldom. So that was our childhood, and the swimming pools in Green Bay and other communities across the country were built in part to respond to the need to get kids some swimming water that was safe. So so I grew up in a working class family in Green Bay. I didn't distinguish myself in academics in any way, but in 1969 I was told by my parents to go to college, and so I did. I went to school at UW River Falls, and again, I wasn't a great student, but somewhere along the line in that setting, I found an environmental ethic that has stuck with me for all the rest of my life. And specifically, I think I found it there along the Kinnickinnick River, west of River Falls. The river was actually clean, which was surprising to me. It was a lot cleaner than those where I grew up, that's for sure. So my buddies and I went there often, and I go back now and then just to revisit that spot because it has a place in my heart. The place you're looking at there is the Kinnickinnick River Gorge, and the cliffs that rise above it where we climbed them and then looked down on the river. We hunted ducks. We just communed with nature in a way that really never left me. So I say that's where I found my environmental ethic. While I was at Utica River Falls, I met this man. That's Gaylord Nelson, the man from Clear Lake, Wisconsin. Was former Wisconsin governor, U.S. senator. And he came to the campus often because I think he liked speaking to student audiences. And I was a student journalist at the college radio station, and so we got to ask him questions. Matter of fact, we used to have we had a 1-hour radio show every night. And among other things we did, because our advisor let us do everything we want, is that sometimes we would just call the U.S. Senate floor and try to get Gaylord Nelson. And by golly, he picked up the phone often and spoke with us, as did other senators and representatives. It was a great gig, and we felt like this was really something that Gaylord Nelson would answer our calls. And it went on for quite a while and was a lot of fun, until the student radio station manager came up to us one day and showed us a bill that we had run up on the state phone line of $120, which in those days was a heck of a lot of money. So we didn't call Senator Nelson that much after that. But he did come to campus office, and he was already a U.S. senator by then, but his conservation credentials were already notable. While he was the governor of Wisconsin, he nurtured the seeds that had been planted by Aldo Leopold and many others, and one of his major accomplishments was the Outdoor Recreation Act program. It was in 1961 it was introduced, a very simple concept, a 10-year, $50 million program to acquire recreation and conservation purposes, land for recreation and conservation purposes. It was paid for by a 1 cent per pack cigarette tax, and there were a lot of people smoking in those days. This innovative program quickly drew national attention, and it was modeled by other states. It created state parks and enhanced forest conservation, but it also helped cities like Stevens Point and Waupaca and others set aside, maintain, and enhance their own green spaces and parks. And the wisdom of those efforts has perhaps never been so apparent as right now during this pandemic, when citizens have flocked to these special places in record numbers. ORAP was a forerunner of today's Knowles Nelson Stewardship Fund, named after Nelson and former Governor Knowles, both of whom were good conservationists, and both of whom they were from different parties, but they both had good conservation credentials. And the Stewardship Fund has some of those same goals. So Nelson, of course, was the founder of Earth Day, and we'll return to that in a bit, but I would first like to take a brief look at another significant environmental story in Wisconsin, and one that's close to my heart, and I dare say it was very important in the United States and internationally, and that was the fight to ban DDT. There was a battle here that was waged in the 1960s. And it's a reminder that Earth Day accomplished an awful lot of things, but there were an awful lot of footsteps that led us in that direction prior to that. And Wisconsin's own conservation history goes back well into the 19th century. And so we had a lot of models who helped us get to where we went in 1970 with Earth Day and where we've been since then. And so I'm going to take a quick stroll through the DDT era. I was lucky enough to write the book, as Ann said earlier, Banning DDT. The Wisconsin Historical Society gave me the privilege of devoting 4 years of my life to that task. And it was a lot of fun, and it's so amazing to review the lives of some of these people who were involved in this penultimate moment. And so here's some of the basics. The DDT story was pretty straightforward as it unfolded. It was actually a wonderful chemical that saved many lives of U.S. military people in World War II from insect-borne diseases such as malaria and typhus. So it has just like many chemicals, it had a good side. In the post-war era, it was put to use for a variety of other causes and to deal with insect pests, as they were called. Agriculture, forestry, and household uses proliferated. It was the treatment of Dutch elm disease in particular that brought people face to face with some of the negative sides of toxicity of DDT. Acute songbird exposure led to robins flopping around on lawns throughout eastern United States. Robins and other songbirds died from acute toxicity. But there was another thing that was happening too, and that was something that took longer to unravel, and therein lies the mystery of that whole DDT story. And that was the sublethal doses that disrupted reproduction in a number of fish and bird species, specifically and notably raptors such as eagles, and we'll learn peregrine falcons. So it really caused ecological havoc in many ways. As with many chemicals, we seem to make this mistake time and again. If a little bit is good, we then decide that a lot is better. And I think we get in trouble that sometimes with that, and DDT is one of those examples. Some key points. So citizens in Wisconsin used an administrative hearing process that was created during the Progressive era in the early part of the 20th century to put DDT on trial. 1968 and 1969, those are tumultuous years in Wisconsin, Wisconsin, U.S. history. And we had civil rights activities, we had anti-war disruptions, we had a whole variety. Martin Luther King was killed in 1968, as was Robert Kennedy. It seemed like every day that some major story was breaking, and they weren't very pretty. The reason that we were able to use an administrative hearing process was because it existed and it gave citizens a chance to challenge the state departments and bureaus that oversaw our lives. And in this case, they sued on the grounds that DDT polluted water. So water became essential to the story. Aldo Leopold's land ethic was central to that effort. People had read his book, and it created a lot of a new breed of conservationists and environmentalists who were willing to step a little farther than some of the groups that were existed at the time. And regular citizens played a difference, and women had a huge role. This was sort of the birth of the modern environmental movement, and I can't stress enough what an important role women played in that particular process. Scientists who were used to being in their laboratories or in their classrooms stepped out of them and into the public sphere, which was difficult for some scientists. An economic case was potential. Once we learned that fish reproduction was also being impacted by the DDT, that brought the fish and tackle and tourist industry into the battle, and it put big dollar signs on what the damage was being caused. The groups that fought it in Wisconsin were the Citizens Natural Resource Association of Wisconsin, sort of a new environmental group that said it was going to be militant in enforcing environmental laws, and also the Environmental Defense Fund, basically a group of New York lawyers who were looking for a way to put DDT on trial, and they found it here. DDT was banned nationally in 1972, and that was in a large part caused by the attention that was drawn to the DDT wars by the Wisconsin administrative hearing process. So Dutch elm disease, DED, and DDT, the key to the story there was how apparent it became to citizens that DDT was causing major damage. It's also very apparent if you lived in a beautiful neighborhood with umbrella elms all over the streets that Dutch elm disease was causing problems, that the slides there show the dramatic differences between a healthy stand of trees and those that had been ravaged by DDT. I worked for the City of Forestry, Green Bay, City Forestry Department in Green Bay when I was going to college, and we spent a lot of time cutting down Dutch elm disease trees, and literally a beautiful tree like those on the left on that slide, once they were infected, could be bare and dead within a couple weeks. It was a dramatic and fast-moving disease that was spread by bark beetles, and it was a fungus that bark beetles laid their eggs in the trees underneath the bark. And as their larvae ate their way out, they spread the fungus, and boom. So there you go. That was a common sight when I was growing up, spraying DDT trees, and also can't tell you how many times I've given this presentation and people have said, oh, that was me dancing in that fog from DDT. So it may explain a lot about some of us who came out of that era. And so that was a common sight. The idea was they tried to spray those trees as heavily as possible. I mean, they just put tons of spray on it. It was an emulsion containing a concentration of DDT, and they warned people off the streets into the houses, and went ahead and did their work at nighttime, and kind of a losing cause, I'm sorry to say. So the citizen activists who changed the way we looked at DDT were led by people like this. Lori Otto was a woman a housewife in Bayside, Wisconsin. Her husband ran a mental hospital nearby, and she was a big gardener, and she also was unafraid to challenge authorities when she thought she was right. And one day she took a basket of dead robins to the Bayside Village administrator and asked him what he was going to do about it. And his response is, "What do you want, lady, birds or trees?" Which was sort of the dispute at the time. It was, he sort of summed it up, but didn't stop her, and so she became the most active citizen among many who were active in the DDT battles in Wisconsin. Gave the effort a human face. She was the only citizen who attended all the hearings, and I might say also she was unafraid, living close to the Milwaukee Journal and the Sentinel, to stomp into their offices and look up their editors and reporters and demand that they do something about this story. She was tireless in her activities, and she was inducted in the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame a number of years ago, and deservedly so. So yes, women played an important role in this story and in the birth of the modern environmental movement. Lucille Stickle was a scientist with the Fish and Wildlife Administration, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Whitney Gould was a journalist at the Capital Times, one of the first women reporters, news reporters at the Capital Times. They both had significant roles, and I'll touch on them briefly in just a minute. So, women were also the foot soldiers to this effort. It took an awful lot of organizing, and things were happening across the state. And council chambers, much like the one I'm standing in here, citizens were enraged by what they were seeing, the damage that was being done, and so they really spoke up. And it was a classic case, and this happens time and again in our history, of where citizens were ahead of politicians on these matters. And politicians eventually took their cue from citizens, but sometimes the true leadership comes from the ground up. And so scientists played a huge role too, and none bigger than this guy, Joe Hickey. And wonderful, wonderful story. I could write a book about Joe Hickey, and I just might someday. But he was a Leopold protege, the first person hired by Aldo Leopold to be his assistant at UW-Madison. So Hickey gets hired in 1948, and Leopold dies shortly after, and Hickey takes over his position of wildlife management, which was in the Department of Agriculture, ill-placed, but that's where in the College of Agriculture. That was ill-placed, but that's where it was. So early on in the 1950s, when we started seeing robins dying off, Hickey and a couple other researchers looked at what was happening in Madison, and they found that there was definitely a link to a pesticide, but they weren't exactly sure what was happening or what was causing the toxicity. So he did a lot of early studies there, and And one of the things that sort of unlocked the door and opened up the whole story was his research and his work on peregrine falcons. So get this, in the 1930s, Joe Hickey was trying to make a living during the Depression. He was working for Consolidated Edison selling power. He hated his job, and so he sustained himself by watching birds. And so sometime in the 1930s or throughout the 1930s, one of his favorite birds was the peregrine falcon. And he took upon it himself to survey falcon eyries or nests all across the eastern United States. 275 of them he had mapped. And then obviously for posterity had their locations. They're often in very remote areas. Peregrine falcons tend to be widespread, but not in heavy concentrations anywhere. And they are in many continents, but never in great concentrations. So in the 1960s, Hickey became aware of the fact that some research had been done in Europe that had showed dramatic declines in peregrine falcon numbers. So what does Joe Hickey do? He says, I'm going to get a couple graduate students and I'm going to have them go revisit the nests that I have carefully mapped across the eastern United States. So he sent these 2 graduate students to retrace his steps and revisit historic nesting sites. Some had been occupied by peregrine falcons for 100 years. And the researchers visited 133 nesting sites from Georgia to Nova Scotia. They did not see a single bird. And this propelled Hickey to leave his laboratory and get into the public arena. He had to seek the answer to a simple question: why? Why was this happening? It took several years to lock this down, the answer, but by the time of the Wisconsin hearings, the CNRA and the Environmental Defense Fund were convinced that DDT had caused eggshell thinning that prevented reproduction among these birds. We didn't notice it at first. Why? Raptors are long-lived. So we would see raptors flying around and thought everything was okay until Joe Hickey and others sort of looked at what was really happening in those nests. What was really happening was nothing. There was no reproductions. So those robins at UW-Madison that he had done research on, and the ones that Laureato and others noticed dying on their front lawns, were dying from acute exposure to DDT, acute toxic exposure. But the story about eggshell thinning was a little harder to track down. And birds, fish, and other species higher up on the food chain were impacted by that inability to reproduce. So this became part of the hearing's transcript, this fact, and this was new news. Whitney Gould had a big role in spreading that story, but Lucille Stickel, that scientist we mentioned earlier from the Fish and Wildlife Service, Pawtuxet Research Center in Maryland, took the stand one day and for the first time ever proclaimed in front of the world that she had solid evidence of what was causing eggshell thinning. This was new information for the world, and it was perhaps the penultimate moment of that hearing. And Whitney Gould, as a reporter for the Capital Times, usually got the scoop on these hearings. It was an afternoon paper at the time. She would run over to the hearing site in the morning, scribble her notes, go back at noon when everybody else was having a sandwich, and she would write her story. And it became the first story that would hit the Associated Press wire and would be spread nationally and internationally. I might also say that these hearings were covered from everyone from network news, every major news magazine, every major newspaper in the country and beyond. Tremendous amount of attention was focused on what was happening in little old Wisconsin. So guess who testified first at the DDT hearing in Madison? Yep, Gaylord Nelson. He was a U.S. Senator at the time. The hearing was a turning point in our nation's environmental history. Citizens had arisen, and by gosh, there was Gaylord Nelson once again. He went on in Washington, D.C. to clamor for a national ban on DDT, one of the leaders in that effort. So So this is 1968, 2 years from Earth Day. So Nelson was occupied with many things, and much of 1969 for him focused on sort of developing the Earth Day program that we saw in 1970. So there he was, and his comments, literally his first comment at the hearing, that we're heading toward an environmental disaster. Some lessons we learned from DDT. This is one that we should know pretty well by now. Humans are capable of global imprint. DDT was used in only a couple of continents, but it showed up on every continent in the world. And that's because it traveled well up the food chain, and the animals, migrating birds and other animals, moved it to different continents. So it was literally so persistent in the environment that it could not be, it was found everywhere. And so that was a big key, that one that we want to remember as we look at environmental issues today. These catastrophes can be avoided, and nature is resilient. And often it's the citizens who make the difference. And in the case of DDT, they made an economic case which was helpful. And those who opposed the ban on DDT attacked science that was emerging, much like today's climate denial. So history does repeat itself. And so again, we're capable of having a global imprint by our actions, but we're also capable of reversing them, and we're also capable, and nature is resilient, and we are blessed by that fact. It's just a little slide to show you. Bald eagles are often the star of the DDT story, right, because they were the national bird and they all came back. I personally am more attached to peregrine falcons, but that's another story. 1974, so this was 2 years after DDT had been banned, and frankly, its use had been dramatically reduced by the time 1974 came around. The State Department, the Forestry Department stopped using it, the DNR stopped using it, and it was still used somewhat on farm fields, but there had been a dramatic reduction in its use already. So you can see there's a smattering of bald eagle nests there in 1974, and then if you look at last year, 2019, there were 1,684 occupied bald eagle nests in Wisconsin. The only county in Wisconsin that does not have an occupied bald eagle's nest, at least since this report, was Milwaukee County. And I wouldn't be surprised if that hadn't changed. So again, a reminder just how resilient nature is. And my gosh, it's a reminder that we can repair our misdeeds of earlier times. There's an awful lot of environmental reckoning taking place in the middle of the last century. I mean, we were seeing examples of PCB exposure causing deformity in a variety of species. New York City in 1966 with its beautiful smoggy picture there. So DDT was by no means the only story. And Americans were appalled by pictures of rivers in Ohio burning. Air pollution from industry and power plants shrouded cities in smog, and it took countless lives. I mean, we don't know how many lives were lost during that period just because of people breathing unhealthy air. Usually this was low-income populations. This was people who couldn't afford to live elsewhere. Americans everywhere, though, were clamoring for change. And Gaylord Nelson sensed the mood and seized the moment and created Earth Day. I'm going to read you a little passage from one of Nelson's comments he gave on Earth Day. But his idea was simply to use the event as a national teach-in. College campuses, high schools across the country, city meeting rooms, all were supposedly focusing in their own way on the environment. And in that way, it appealed to all citizens, and there were millions of participants in Earth Day. Now it's celebrated around the world, but at that time, the first one was really Gaylord Nelson's baby. And It was attacked by those on the left and the right. Those on the left attacked it because they said, well, it was diverting attention from other serious issues such as the Vietnam conflict and the civil rights issues in the country. Those on the right said it was a communist plot. Some of them, the John Birch Society accused him of foisting a secret Marxist plot on the nation because April 22nd happened to be the birthday of Vladimir Lenin. And Nelson's reply was, well, I didn't realize that it was Lenin's birthday, but I did know that it was the birthday of St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of the environment, and more importantly, my Aunt Tilly. And so Gaylord Nelson had a way of arguing around his competitors. Interestingly, in Madison, Wisconsin, the parade for the Earth Day permit was revoked the day before Earth Day. So there was not an Earth Day parade in Madison. There were often a number of events, and in his speech on the eve of Earth Day, Nelson made it clear that he saw the movement as broadly focused. Pretty significant passage, I think. This is from Bill Christopherson's great book, The Man from Clear Lake, Earth Day founder, Senator Gaylord Nelson. And it's a compelling read. I'm not going to read you the whole book, but I'm going to read you about half a page. So Nelson made it clear in his speech at the University of Wisconsin on Earth Day Eve that this was truly a broadly focused movement. And he said, our goal is not to forget about the worst environments in America, in the ghettos, in Appalachia, and elsewhere. Our goal is an environment of decency, quality, and mutual respect for all human beings and all other living creatures. An environment without ugliness, without ghettos, without poverty, without discrimination, without hunger, and without war. Our goal is a decent environment in its deepest and broadest sense. The battle to restore a proper relationship between man and his environment, between man and other living creatures, will require a long, sustained political, moral, ethical, and financial commitment far beyond any commitment ever made by any society in the history of man. Are we able? Yes. Are we willing? That's the unanswered question. Still unanswered to this day, to some extent, right? But Earth Day was an era of major progress. Just a few of the many, many laws that were passed in the 1970s and 1980s, often in bipartisan fashion. President Nixon established the EPA in 1970, NEPA in 1970, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, which is so important to Wisconsin. Some of these laws are very controversial to this day. Many Western states would just assume we didn't have an Endangered Species Act. Same for NEPA, which requires environmental impact statements for major projects. We've seen efforts to weaken the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. So it's an ongoing struggle, and that's one of the things we learn about conservation of environmental resources is it's never ending. But it was an era of tremendous accomplishment, and probably one of the most significant, I believe, moments in the history of the U.S. government as a relationship to the natural world. So here in Wisconsin, we had significant gains too. The efforts to clean up the Fox River of my youth and the Wisconsin River of my adulthood were underway. The Fox River cleanup of PCB and PBB contamination ended this year. Took 2 decades and cost $1 billion. But in addition to all these laws and other things that we saw coming out of there, it's a time that we sort of changed our expectations or looked at our expectations different, took a turn in another direction. I'm reminded in 1968, folks who live along the Wapaka chain of lakes decided that water quality was important enough that they would join a municipal water system rather than have their own private septic systems. The people standing along the shoreline of the Wisconsin River there in Stevens Point are waiting for a fireworks display that occurred annually around the 4th of July. Believe me, those people would not have been that close to the river in 1960. That would not have been a place where they went. It was sort of a forgotten area, and now it's one of that park structure along the Wisconsin River is one of the most popular places in central Wisconsin. It's the way it is everywhere in the country. We've seen dramatic water quality improvement that has in turn enhanced urban development and redevelopment in areas like the Kennebec River in Maine, and name it, all up and down the United States, especially the eastern United States. We've seen dramatic water quality improvements that have also improved the quality of life and the economic fortunes of the people who live in these areas. It's becoming a major economic driver. We've had a blossoming of natural areas and trails and green spaces. Once again, our expectations are different now. We're no longer willing to accept degradation of air and water as business as usual. Wisconsin's now a huge trout fishing destination due to the many efforts of many stream ecologists with the Department of Natural Resources and with private groups like Trout Unlimited in the 1960s and 1970s to do the simple act of rehabilitating the streams. And rather than introducing stocked species every year, giving the streams the opportunity to be natural breeding grounds for these fish species. So we're getting natural reproduction on streams across the state. And so there's just, the Wapaka-Tomorrow River is one example of where we've done that and done it pretty well. We're not perfect by any means, but we're getting a lot better. And for those of us who remember the way it was, those of us old enough like me to remember the way it was, we need to remind younger generations of that, of how far we have come and how important those times were and how important it is to guard what we've gained. And I think that's the job of people in my age group, and I think it's just an absolute necessity that we not let this story get forgotten. So I'm going to get personal again with you for a little bit. During that era, I was a cub reporter in a variety of newspapers in Wisconsin, and trying to make a living in business that wasn't very known to pay very well. And so I was very lucky that I was able to cover some major environmental stories while working for several of these state newspapers, especially in central Wisconsin. So George Rogers, the guy at the left there, was the longtime editor and publisher of the Stevens Point Journal. He hired me in 1980 to be his #2 editor. He sent me a letter one day and said, "I'd like to offer you this job. Here are the terms." I don't have to interview? He offered me the job right on the spot, and I think it was because I had spent an awful lot of time up in Wausau at the Daily Herald chasing every environmental story I could find. I was living out my dreams that were born on the Kinnickinnick River in River Falls, and George simply said, "Come on down here and work." Some other key figures in central Wisconsin at the time: Byron Shaw, a water quality specialist at the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point, was so far ahead of everyone else with his research in areas like nitrates. His research on acid rain changed the way the state dealt with that and led to major changes. We'll talk a little bit about his work in the area of groundwater quality here in central Wisconsin. Woman on the right is Mary Ann Krieger. I call her a 1980s version of Lori Otto. She was doing the same thing up here from Stevens Point resident. She and her husband ran a office supply business, and she became one of the strongest advocates for groundwater quality in Wisconsin and was virtually unstoppable once she got going. So while I was here in Stevens Point, I got to cover a whole bunch of fun environmental stories, and many of them were positive at the time. Together, George and the rest of us covered the cleanup of the Wisconsin River as a result of the Clean Water Act, groundwater qualities in the Golden Sands region, acid rain, and many other stories like that. And Byron Shaw, of course, his research was thrusting us in that direction, and people like Mary Ann Krieger were the citizens who, once again, ahead of the politicians on this. So I'd like to just focus just for a few minutes here on one story in particular. So Bonnie Bressers was a crackerjack reporter at the Point Journal. We had a small staff then, so in the morning she would type up wedding announcements, and in the evening she would cover complex environmental stories. That's just how it was. We all did things like that. But she covered groundwater quality issues in Wisconsin and central Wisconsin and beyond. And it was Byron Shaw's research that showed that a particular pesticide, aldicarb, used on potatoes to control the Colorado potato beetle, was leaching the groundwater in the central sands region of Wisconsin, central Wisconsin. Aldicarb was one of the most toxic pesticides known to humankind. Nonetheless, Shaw's research made him persona non grata in many circles, especially those that were thriving in the food processing industry and large agriculture. But he kept at it, and at the Stevens Point Journal, we kept hammering away at this story. Bonnie Bressers attended hundreds of meetings and wrote numerous detailed stories. And like Whitney Gould at the Capital Times years earlier, she was able to interpret and make understandable complex science under a daily deadline. And so it was a real fun time to be chasing a very important story. So at one point along the way, Union Carbide, which was at the time the manufacturer of aldicarb, was sued for causing loss of property value when the pesticides started showing up in residential wells. And at one point their response was that they couldn't get a fair trial here in central Wisconsin because the Stevens Point Journal was making it tough. So the little tiny Stevens Point Journal got the attention of Union Carbide. I always felt that was worth making a note of. So the story went on, and eventually Union Carbide sold the rights to manufacture aldicarb to another manufacturer who quickly removed it from the market before it could be banned. It removed from the market before it could be banned. And it was banned eventually internationally in 2015, so it took a while. But because of this story in particular, Wisconsin in 1983 passed one of the nation's most comprehensive groundwater protection laws. It wasn't perfect, but it was hailed as a model for other states. At the Stevens Point Journal, we felt as though our coverage of the issue helped put the spotlight on groundwater protection across the state and helped lead to the groundwater quality law, which was indeed the main sponsors were legislators from central Wisconsin. Groundwater quality law is still at work to this day. Just last week, the State Department of Health and Social Services proposed new standards on 22 substances, including 16 PFAS, or the so-called forever chemicals, and 6 pesticides. That 1983 is a long time ago, right? It doesn't seem like it necessarily for some of us, but it was a long time ago. It gave the Department of Health and Social Services, the DNR, and the Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection various roles in addressing water quality. DHS's role, the Department of Health Services, appropriately, was to protect human health. The DNR's role is to protect the resource and enforce standards. So now, based on the action just last week, the DNR will go back and initiate rulemaking on these recommendations and establish standards. The Wisconsin groundwater law has worked this way for 37 years. It has overall been a success, although there are ongoing challenges. PFAS is one of them, the new breed of chemicals that we're dealing with. But it was a kind of a happy story that we were able to contribute as journalists to here in central Wisconsin. Here's a reminder that there were good guys in the world of business and industry at this time. The guy on the left is George Meade. I call this slide the Georges. The guy on the left is George Meade, who was a longtime CEO of Consolidated Papers in Wisconsin Rapids. The guy on the right is obviously my mentor and friend, George Rogers, my boss at the Stevens Point Journal. I took this picture at a social event in Port Edwards. I don't really remember what it was. But that George Meade fella, he was determined that Consolidated Papers was not only going to meet, but was going to exceed Clean Water Act river cleanup recommendations and standards. He went about to do that. Other industrialists claimed the standards would do irreparable harm to their bottom lines, but George Meade set a tremendous example for the business community. And years later, I was able to share a beer with George Meade on the banks of the Wisconsin River at the Wisconsin Rapids Blues Fest in downtown Rapids. The river was clean, and so was the beer. So again, a reminder of the role that leaders like George Meade can play, and he and George Rogers were good friends. So rounding the bend here, those are some good stories. We have some more challenging ones that face us. Obviously, climate change is among the greatest. Also is the extinction event that's occurring right now, loss of habitat worldwide. A story that got lost in the pandemic was during the California, what we refer to as climate fires. Researchers at Stanford said that up to 3,000 people in California died of respiratory illness between August 1st and September 10th. Did anyone hear that on the news? Those are stories that sort of slip below the surface sometimes. So we have some real challenges there. Just a few days ago, the Federal Reserve for the first time named climate change as a risk to the financial stability of our country and the world. And in doing so, it said that it would be much more severe, the financial impacts of climate change would be much more severe than the current pandemic. The warmest years globally, the top 10 warmest years globally have all occurred since 1998. Something is going on, my friends. And I guess we got to fix it. Coon Valley, Wisconsin, 2018, something like 17 inches of rain. And Coon Valley was once a model for conservation practices on private lands that prevented erosion, prevented water from moving that way off of sites. We're dealing with a different era now. So hope is a dangerous word, right? But there is reason to be hopeful. And there are some of the reasons. A huge majority of those 18 to 29 really believe we have to do something about climate change. And by the way, they turned out in record numbers in the recent election. 10 years ago, I worked in the conservation of private lands for 20 years. I left the newspaper business in 1997, full-time newspaper business, and went to work on private lands conservation issues for a national conservation group. Worked a lot with farmers. And just a decade ago, there was dramatic, heavy denial about climate change among the agricultural community. That's rapidly changed, in good part due to the soil health practitioners in the farming community who are really revolutionizing what we know as agriculture in the United States. There are measures that include simple things like cover crops and enhancing the organic content of the soil and no-till practices and things of that sort. And go figure, most of those practices have positive impacts on such things as carbon sequestration. So I think we're going to see us move quickly in the direction of enhancing, through incentives and other tools, soil health practices. And I think in the agricultural community, that's going to mean a big deal. In a few weeks, the U.S. will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Some of that's Some of that's real and some of it's fairy dust, but I think it's a very important thing to be a part of. And that's going to be just a couple years off, a couple weeks off. The International Energy Agency recently predicted renewable energy will be the main generator in another just a few years, 2025. My goodness, we're almost there. Of course, here come electric vehicles. That's going to be a major impact. It's not perfect because, yes, we're not going to be using fossil fuels to fill up our automobiles, but somewhere along the line we have to produce the energy that propels those cars, but it will be a net gain, and it'll be a major net gain. And transportation is the #1 sector that's tied to climate change. So there's some reasons for hope, and citizens do make a difference. There's just a small list of those people who are inducted in the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame, who we could generally call citizen activists. And if you went to each of their individual stories, they would be fighting the same battles time and again in a different area. And there's been a few more since I put that slide together. So Wisconsin's rich conservation history is alive and well, and we've had some setbacks in recent years, but I think we still have the potential to have bipartisan support for doing the right things. So here's to the future, okay? The guy in the green shirt sitting at that table is a fellow named Greg Septon. He has spent much of the last 30 years of his life carefully tending to nests of peregrine falcons that are placed atop of power plants and tall buildings and industrial buildings across the state. He gets help from corporations like We Energies. This is in Wausau at the Weston facility in Wausau, and Greg and one of his helpers from We Energy is banding peregrine falcon chicks. And it's an annual event that draws school children from across the Wausau area. And as you can see, there's a pretty high level interest among those young folks who are soon going to be voters and who are now coming face to face with peregrine falcons for the first time in their lives. So Greg Septon has devoted his life to helping the peregrine falcon rebound in Wisconsin, and just one of many, many people who have done that. So I appreciate you all listening. I think we have enough time for thank you. And again, thanks to Winchester Academy.
Thank you, Bill. We've got a question here from Facebook from a gentleman named Jim Connors. What needs to be addressed with having better water currently in central Wisconsin?
Better water quality in central Wisconsin is an ongoing issue, and it's a challenging one because agricultural practices have changed dramatically over the years. Nitrates and phosphorus in particular it's a very good question from Mr. Connor too, because the Clean Water Act was a great first step, but it had some big holes, and one big hole is this whole area of non-point pollution. Otherwise, all the pollution that doesn't come from pipes attached to industrial buildings or municipal treatment facilities. So there's a whole wide array of ways that other substances move into water. Nitrate levels continue to rise in the state of Wisconsin, and nationwide, as do phosphorus levels. This phosphorus in particular causes the blooms of blue-green algae in our water bodies. Nitrate research has continued to show health effects that we didn't know about even just a few years ago from nitrates, including cancers of various sorts. And so some states are moving to change the standards for nitrates. I personally think that Wisconsin's standard of 10 parts per million should be more like 5 parts per million, or at least an action level. When it reaches 5 parts per million, you have to do something. But if you look at municipalities right here across central Wisconsin, most of them have seen their nitrate levels increase. Some of them have had to go to nitrate treatment facilities, costly to both install and to maintain and operate. And so much better if we can nip it in the bud there closer to the source. And so, good question, and that's just one of many challenges, but that's one that stands out.
Here's another one. This is from Maggie Thompson. In the 1970s, in the suburbs east of Cleveland, Ohio, malathion spraying was used to control mosquitoes. What was ignored was that the best natural control was dragonflies, but they were way more vulnerable to the insecticide than were the mosquitoes. So the dragonfly population was hard hit while the mosquitoes flourished. What are the natural controls of such pests as mosquitoes that might be used these days?
Good question, Maggie. Again, with broad spectrum pesticides, we can see this problem time and again. So that the natural predators of one insect species die along with this insect species we've targeted. Agriculture has tried to move past this a little bit with such techniques as integrated pest management, where we use a variety of techniques to control pests, insect pests. Really, we live in the world of insects, right? We're just occupants in their world. But the natural means of control, that's why broad spectrum pesticides are so, we have to be so careful with how we use them, because they don't discriminate. The good ladybugs are killed along with those bad Colorado potato beetles. Both of them are a beetle species. One of them is our friend, one of them are not our friend. So.
I don't actually have a question, but back in April 22nd of 1970, I was a librarian at a junior high school in Neenah, and I remember everyone on that day was a day with no regular classes, but it was a teach-in effect, and I remember that all the staff, librarians as well as all the staff members, worked for a long time to gather as many materials as they could to present to those students. There were films and there were slides and film strips and all kinds of materials like that to inform as well as to motivate those students. And I wonder how many of them really, how much it really changed the minds of many of those students and got them thinking about that, and maybe some of them really went into that field as well. I'd like to think they did. It was a great event, very exciting.
And a great comment, and that was the genius of Earth Day, and that was Gaylord Nelson's genius. He said he didn't want this to be a national event. He wanted it, he set up a committee to help communities develop programs just like that, but it was in their hands. They developed their own programs at a local level based on their local conservation issues and needs, and that was one of the reasons why Earth Day was such a success, and why it continues to be. It's not something driven from up here down there. He opened the door to let that happen, and I too wonder the impacts of those early days. One thing I will say is that the College of Natural Resources at the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point in 1970 probably had a few women in their ranks. Now there are as many or more women in the College of Natural Resources working on resources issues than men. The retired dean, Christine Thomas of the College of Natural Resources, who retired this past year, like me, was a 69, or class of 69, and so she came from that era. So I don't think there's any doubt but that it had an impact. Did it have a lasting impact that we want? It's an ongoing struggle.
Similar to Maggie, I have a recollection being on a Girl Scout canoe trip down the Wisconsin River. It was probably 1968, and it was stinky. I think we went by Mosinee and Wausau, and there were these floating, bubbling masses that just reeked, and I'm sure it was from the paper mills, and that was before all of these environmental acts were passed by the federal government for clean water and whatnot, and boy, things have sure improved.
They sure have. Joe Jansen's in the room here, and Joe grew up in De Pere near where I grew up, and I'm sure you have memories of that time too.
Well, yeah, I was about...
Get to a microphone.
I was about a half a block from the river, but I was upwind. Which
Right. Very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we did see every now and then boaters out there, but that was about it. And I grew up duck hunting on the river with my dad. We ate the ducks. I don't know if we should have, but yeah, it was a mess. And of course, it was Nicolay Paper Company, north and south of that. Paper companies all over the place. Yeah,
and again, and it was the reason you saw those floating masses was that was just simply the organic matter that was pumped into the river during the paper mill process, and so it needed oxygen to be decomposed, so it took the oxygen from the river. And yeah, I had pleasant memories of putting a pillow over my head when I was trying to sleep in my working class home without air conditioning 8 blocks downwind of the Fox River. But those are the kind of stories that we need to remind people of. Those people who lived through that era, we have a responsibility, I think, to tell those stories.
Well, I think we've come to the end of the Q&A, unless anybody else has any comments here in the studio audience. Thank you, Bill. This was great.
Thank you for your time.